I'd like to welcome everyone to today's event, which is the second in a special series designed to explore democracy from a humanities perspective. My name is Amanda Anderson. I'm the director of the Kogut Institute for the Humanities. So these events are 1-hour lunchtime events that include a short paper, followed by 2 responses, and then an open conversation with the audience. Through this format, we're trying to showcase the forms of layered understanding and engaged debate that humanities scholars bring to the study of political life. And at least for now, we've been concentrating on hearing from our own colleagues here at Brown as a way to foster communities of conversation during what has been a very challenging year. Our featured speaker today is Tal Lewis, Professor of Religious Studies, as well as Co-Deputy Dean and Associate Dean of Academic Affairs in the Graduate School at Brown University, where he's done amazing work concentrating on improving graduate education. He specializes in religious ethics, the philosophy of religion, and the significance of tradition, reason, and authority in ethical and political thought. His most recent book, Why Philosophy Matters for the Study of Religion and Vice Versa, was published by Oxford in 2015. Irina Kalinka, our first respondent, is a 5th-year PhD student in the Department of Modern Culture and Media at Brown University. She holds a BA in Politics and Human Rights from Bard College and an MA in English Literatures from Humboldt University, Berlin. Her previous work experience includes serving as an elected county council representative for the Green Party in Germany. She will be joining the Kogut Institute as a graduate fellow next year, where she will be working on her dissertation on new media and the digital imaginary of what she calls user democracy. Melvin L. Rogers, the second respondent, is Associate Professor and Director of Graduate Studies in the Department of Political Science. He is the co-editor of the recently released African American Political Thought, A Collected History, published by Chicago in 2020, and author of The Darkened Light of Faith, Race, Democracy, and Freedom in African American Political Thought, to be published by Princeton University Press. And you can read longer biographies of each of our speakers in the chat. Before we start with Tal's paper, I just want to alert everyone to the fact that we welcome questions submitted through the Q&A function and really kind of urge you to get those in as early as you can, because that way we will have a chance to get to them. Sometimes with these shorter events, people don't really get around to submitting the question until we're basically very close to the end. So I just really urge you to send them at any point. You don't need to wait until you've heard both responses. So with that, we will turn to our main speaker, Tal Lewis.
Great. Thank you very much, Amanda. It is great to get to be here today. I want to thank everyone who is generous enough with their time to be spending noon here. But also a particular thanks to Amanda Anderson, to Traude Kestner, as well as to Lisa Noble for making this happen. And to Melvin Rogers and Irina Kalinka for their responses, which I'm very much looking forward to hearing. It is to be considered just a folly of modern times to alter a system of corrupt ethical life, its political constitution and legislation, without changing the religion, to have made a revolution without a reformation, to suppose that with the old religion and its sanctities, a political constitution opposed to it can have internal peace and harmony, and that stability can be procured for the laws by external guarantees, e.g. so-called chambers and the power given them to determine the budget and the like. To want to separate the rights and laws from religion when we are powerless to descend into the depths of the religious spirit and to elevate that very spirit to its truth is to be regarded as no more than a stopgap. Those guarantees are but rotten bulwarks against the conscience of the subjects who are supposed to apply the laws, and that includes the guarantees themselves. Constitutions must be defended, by political parties and organized citizens, but also by democratic norms. Without robust norms, constitutional checks and balances do not serve as the bulwarks of democracy we might imagine them to be. My comments today focus on the deep resonances between these two quotes. As we attend to the current state and fate of democracy, we often seek to expose and critique what is taken for granted, what remains invisible, as well as to highlight the importance of bringing into view what is hidden. Bonnie Honig's talk in the previous session of this series was a great example of that. My remarks take a different, though complementary approach. I want to draw attention to the positive significance of what we can take for granted, of certain commitments not requiring scrutiny or interrogation. I want us to reflect on the value that can adhere in certain situations and having the background simply stay in the background. I have in mind, for instance, the idea of taking for granted that, unless there are specific reasons to doubt it, we can trust the work of ballot counters, or that we can take for granted the role of branches of government constraining the other branches. I want to approach this issue through an engagement with G.W.F. Hegel's account of the role of habits and dispositions in upholding a political order, as well as religion's role in shaping and instilling those habits. Attending carefully to Hegel's specific conceptualization of religion, a broad conceptualization that includes many practices we might not typically label religious, enables us to see the power of Hegel's account in illuminating the unconscious habits that make political institutions work. Hegel was profoundly concerned with what might hold societies together in the face of a wide array of forces that seemed to be pushing them apart. His historical context was not one of stability or homogeneity. With the example of the devolution of the French Revolution into the violence and chaos of the Terror vivid before him, he was acutely aware that even the most enlightened political agenda would not automatically be successful. A viable social and political order, Hegel came to believe, requires a sense of belonging among its members and the broad support of its legal and political structures. As signaled in the passage quoted, collective life depends not simply on good laws, but on shared commitments among members of the polity. The commitments must be widely shared, sustaining cohesion within the society and in support of the dominant legal and political institutions. To be sure, in some situations, collapse of the institutions will be better than the alternatives if they are unjust institutions. Yet I want to focus here on what it will take to sustain political orders and institutions that we have reason to defend. As much as Hegel emphasizes self-consciousness, crucial elements of his political thought derive from the central role of habit in his account of what human beings are. While he also champions the importance of laws being written down and subject to debate, Hegel holds that the functioning of our society is profoundly determined by the habituated dispositions of its members, not merely by the laws on the books. A society's functioning depends on the practices and norms that have come to be deeply ingrained habits for its citizens. Hegel attends to the process through which such practices come to be second nature for us, that is, the manner in which they come to be taken for granted. He introduces the notion of habit in relation to very basic physical sensations, discussing the way in which we become accustomed to certain sensations. What you might think of the feel of your shoes on your feet or the feel of your chair against your back, of which we are often not conscious. Another stage of habit involves activities becoming so natural to us that we're not actively conscious of performing them. And there are admittedly many steps between these kinds of relatively elementary habits and the habits that are more involved in political life. Yet Hegel helps us to identify a common structure. In each case, the subject's activity is determined by a more general pattern of behavior that overrides any more immediate impulses. And insofar as this more general pattern is habituated, we are not conscious of it, which doesn't mean that we could never become conscious of it. But insofar as it's habituated, we are not necessarily. As Hegel states in the context of habits pertinent to social and political life, quote, "Pedagogy is the art of making human beings ethical It considers them as natural beings and shows them how they can be reborn and how their original nature can be transformed into a second spiritual nature so that this spirituality becomes habitual to them. When we get to the context of our social and political relations, the relevant habits are themselves expressions of conceptions of who we are. Though we are not often aware of them in this way, unconscious shifts in our body language and our spoken language, depending upon whether we're talking with an older relative, a professor, or a student, may reflect conceptions of how these subjects relate to each other, such as what authority and what consideration are due to each. Rather than being mere formalities, these habits both mold and express our sense of who we are, who others around us are, and how we should relate to each other. Our practices of deference and bestowing authority, for instance, are often deeply ingrained unconscious habits that themselves manifest conceptions of who we collectively are. Habits, then, are the key bearers of some of our most orienting conceptions of who we are and what matters. Though Hegel's account of ethical, social, and political life also involves forms of reflexivity that go well beyond habit, even the most reflective and self-critical form of ethical life can only emerge on the basis of habits. His claim is that our collective life is constituted not simply by a series of discrete, explicit decisions by particular individuals, but by a background of habituated practices. In many cases, those practices are taken for granted and not reflected upon. At key moments, we may be prompted to reflect upon them explicitly, but it's crucial for Hegel to see how unconsciously they generally operate and how integral they are to sustaining our collective life. The passage from Hegel with which I began develops this point. There, Hegel points to the essential role of underlying habits in supporting a legal structure, habits that express our deepest commitments about who we are, what we are owed, and how we ought to order our collective life. Without that support, even the most perfectly conceived political structures are but rotten bulwarks. This passage links these habits to religious formation, and a key part of Hegel's point is to claim that a Protestant Prussia, rather than a Catholic France, could realize the ideals of freedom that in part motivated the French Revolution. In making that connection, Hegel draws upon the central role that he attributes to religion in forming our habits, a point to which I will turn in just a moment. Yet that point should not obscure the no less central claim that even the best constitutional structures and safeguards will be defeated if they're not supported by the habits and intuitions of those with power in society. We cannot rely on laws and constitutional structures alone, but must be profoundly concerned with the habits and dispositions of our citizenry. To understand religion's pivotal role in the epigraph, though, we have to appreciate its central role in shaping our deepest dispositions and intuitions about who we are. Hegel contends that, for most people, our most habitual intuitive sense of who we are will be formed by a body of practices, imagery, stories, and representations about what is taken to be absolute or the ground of authority, what Hegel calls spirit. For Hegel, this array of practices, imagery, narratives, and representations is what we should call religion. Hegel conceptualizes religion both in terms of these practices and representations on one hand, but also what he takes to be its object, God, which he will ultimately analyze in terms of spirit. Now, it's very, very easy to misread Hegel by importing preconceptions of the meaning of these key terms, God and spirit. And I take a central task of his lectures on the philosophy of religion to be the unpacking of this term God, which initially serves more as a placeholder than as any sort of contentful notion. The aspect of Hegel's conception of spirit that is crucial in the present context concerns his argument that spirit is what we as human beings are. How one cashes out the meaning of that claim will depend upon one's reading of Hegel's larger project. I've argued that Hegel does in some sense equate theology and anthropology, but that this should not be confused with a physicalist reductionism. Others offer more traditional, emphatically metaphysical readings of Hegel's conception of spirit. Fortunately, however, those interpretive differences are not crucial to the point I'm making here. Regardless of how one ultimately interprets Hegel's conception of spirit, the point at issue is that Hegel conceives of spirit as what defines us as human beings. Thus, representations of what spirit is are also representations of what we human beings are. For Hegel, then, religion provides a key manner in which a group represents its conception of itself. It's the principal form in which human communities develop their understandings of themselves. And he understands different religions to conceive of this object differently, but they each constitute that community's understanding of who or what we are, even when participants don't recognize the representations in these terms. The representations of spirit provided by religion are particularly impactful because they're the form in which this content is most widely available. They are accessible to sense experience or understanding. Where philosophy also portrays this content and does so for Hegel in a more authoritative form, he views philosophy as more relevant only to a smaller set of the society. The practices and representations that he conceives in terms of religion are more widely prevalent and accessible, and therefore play a much greater role than philosophy in shaping a group's understanding of itself. Beyond representing a group's self-conception, that is, portraying it in representational form, representational practices, religious practices and institutions place a crucial role in instilling this self-conception. His account of this process rests upon the conception of habituation. While attention to more obvious religious rituals, such as sacraments and sacrifices, is central to his understanding of the formative work of religious traditions, no less important is his identification of the way that aspects of practice shape our habits and consciousness. He points to the way in which manners of dress instill a sense of gravity about certain topics and subtly but powerfully bring us into a community of practices and beliefs, particularly as children. Moreover, he indicates powerfully that the relevant practices are not only those codified in liturgies, but also generally less explicitly formalized practices, such as how one dresses, where one stands, and who's included as part of the community. These more and less formalized practices play key roles in instilling our deepest intuitions about who we most fundamentally are. His powerful account of the role of religious communities in cultivating habits and dispositions that are fundamental to political life is easily overlooked if we think about religion too narrowly. For many of us, explicitly religious institutions have not played those roles in our lives that Hegel attributes to religion. Yet if we attend carefully to his conceptualization of religion in terms of the array of practices, imagery, narratives, and representations that shape and express our conceptions of who we are collectively, then we can begin to see his account as illuminating the subtle way in which a wide range of relevant habits are formed. Whether in civics class, family gatherings, clubs, or other groups, and the powerful work that they do in supporting or undermining political structures. Finally, I want to turn very briefly back to my opening mention of the positive value of what we can take for granted. More than a point about Hegel, my concern is to highlight the value of deeply instilled habits and dispositions that support the political institutions that we want to defend. Good arguments are essential but insufficient. The long-term success of movements for political change will depend on the development of practices that cultivate habits that sustain the corresponding institutions. We need to forge unconscious habits, not just the critical thinking. These practices and habits need to become part of the background, what we don't always need to reflect upon and defend. And as much as we need to be prepared to argue for commitments when they're questioned, a key element of sustainable transformation is that such occasions for defense are relatively rare. When the questions are widespread, as when we cannot take for granted that increasing access to voting is a good thing, or that branches of government do have a role in constraining each other, they are signs of weakening bulwarks and require deliberate action to reinforce these supports before they collapse. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Tal, for that incredibly thought-provoking talk. We will now turn to Irina Kalinka, who will give our first response.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing this thought-provoking project with us, Tal. And thank you to Amanda and everyone at the Kogist Institute for organizing and having me as part of this great event and series. I want to structure my response today around two crucial questions that this project raises for me. First, how are we habituated into citizenship today? Who and what maintains the background that upholds our shared sense of belonging and commitments to certain political institutions and norms? If it is no longer predominantly religion, which provides the body of practices, rituals, imageries, stories, and representations that instill a sense of a group's self-conception, what has taken its place? Where do we learn to imagine ourselves as belonging to a collectivity, to orient and locate ourselves in political community? This paper offers a few suggestions, mentioning civics classes, family gatherings, clubs, or other groups, and the powerful work that they do in supporting or undermining political structures. I would add public discourse, media representations, pedagogy, and crucially technology to that list, as other arenas where normative notions of politics, selves, bodily practice, and relational authority are instilled and upheld, and in times of challenging crisis, stabilized to continue being a kind of second nature, that which goes without saying. Like democracy itself, however, the ways we are habituated are multiple, and I would add, not necessarily in harmony with each other. What I learned in civics class might not be what I see modeled at a family gathering, for example. Instead, one background might encourage its own unconscious orientation, while another orients us differently. This raises a related question for me. If we agree with the conclusion here that the long-term success of movements for political change will depend on the development of practices that cultivate habits that sustain the corresponding institutions, how do we go about achieving this goal? First, where's the most promising place to promote or fight over the dispositions we seek to cultivate? And secondly, is it possible to cultivate a particular background without again making it come to the fore, explicitly arguing for a certain sense of what should go without saying, critically thinking about how to institute certain norms for them to either regain strength or else become hegemonic when they had not been so before? I'm a bit doubtful. It takes a long road of explicit and collective struggle, argument, and organizing to reach the point of having one's value become a norm, become a habit. Something so widely accepted it goes without saying. It moves our bodies into action without thought, as if no long history of struggle got us here, and such practices had always been a fact of life. This leads me to my second question. The concern here is with a, quote, formal structural account that does not tell us about the value of particular political institutions. This left me wondering, however, if structure and value can be so completely separated. How do we cultivate the habits and dispositions we would like to see guiding our societies while not sacrificing the fundamental democratic freedom to question, to refuse, and to challenge the background? In other words, to destabilize the bulwarks. Structural injustice, for example, does not just uphold explicit violence and exclusions. White supremacy, sexism, they too are deeply instilled and hard to break habits. This is especially true in the example of deference and bestowing authority mentioned here. Who is unconsciously accepted as the face of expertise, and who gets to unquestionably argue in the name of the public good of all? So in other words, how do we balance such much needed critical interventions into the background with safeguarding the bulwarks of democracy that we cherish? Further, who has the authority to make that distinction? Though a key element of sustainable transformation might be that challenges to habituated norms become relatively rare over time, as the paper mentions at the end, they will never go away. And that too is a good thing. Democracy to me is a political system without an essence. It is the never-ending work of articulating and practicing our shared commitments over and over and over again, together with others, while also leaving space for transformation and challenge. It might be that this contentless disposition itself may be an open placeholder, never to be filled. This commitment to articulating community again and again is value and habit at the same time. So this is then the final question I want to leave you with. Can openness to transformation be itself a democratic habit that we aim to cultivate? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irina. That was absolutely wonderful. And now we will turn to Melvin.
Great, thank you, Amanda. And let me also thank Tal for these rich and I think importantly suggestive set of reflections. So I say suggestive because behind Tal's account, although not precisely stated in these terms, is a broader understanding of democracy than we typically have in view. When we typically think about or talk about democracy, what we have in mind are a set of formal political institutions and processes. We often have in mind things such as elections, political parties, the separate sites of power, both its federal division, think of separation of powers, and the division between federal and state bureaucratic structures. These formal institutions and processes are intended to translate popular views into policy decisions. These institutions and processes are intended to protect citizens against the dangers that threaten their individual freedoms. This is the most recognizable picture of democracy, understood basically as a form of government power in which ordinary citizens participate at various intervals. When Tal tells us through Hegel that, quote, collective life depends not simply on good laws, but on some kind of shared commitments among the members of the polity, he is reaching beyond the description of democracy I just provided. When he invokes the language of habit and habituation, he wants us to believe that whatever else democracy might include, it most certainly involves a set of background dispositions that inform not only our institutions, but that should rightly orient us to those institutions and to each other. Tal is after, although he doesn't put it in these terms, democracy understood as a way of life. In this second sense, democracy itself is a set of norms that ideally structure both political institutions and the patterns of social interaction and society's organizational designs. To say that democracy's application extend to political institutions, the organizations of society, and to citizens is just to say democracy shapes the culture of society. Democracy is a way of telling you something about who we take ourselves to be. If I have read Tal correctly, you may notice that this is only a formal account, and something needs to be said about the content of democracy, those specific norms to which we can be more or less habituated. If we can specify those norms, and I invite Tal to say something about this, but if we can specify those norms, we can use them diagnostically to interrogate the pathologies in our society, whether those pathologies emanate from our political institutions, our economic organizations, public schools, or our daily encounters. Tal, I think, begins to fill this out with his discussion of the importance of religion, once again via Hegel. Well, why religion? So here's Tal's answer. Religion is the principal form in which human communities develop their understanding of themselves. Religion provides, Tal again, an array of practices, imagery, narratives, and representations that shape and express our conceptions of who we are collectively, that then in turn creates a set of habits that can steer or direct society. But here again, we're still at a formal level, albeit now the formal description of religion. And I worry that this account, which I'm very sympathetic to, obscures more than illuminates. So what do I mean when I say it obscures more than illuminates? Well, consider an example. Consider W.B. Du Bois's 1920 remark from Darkwater: a nation's religion is its life. A nation's religion is its life. Now, I suspect that Hegel and Tal would very much like this formulation of Du Bois's. The problem, of course, is that Du Bois was referring to what he called whiteness. Whiteness, he argued, is a religious worldview in the sense of providing those who inhabit it with idioms for constructing reality, ways of understanding their lives within it, and giving their lives purpose and meaning. Whiteness shapes, Du Bois insisted, the appetitive and spiritual dimensions of character formation, and often involve an array of practices to fortify itself. One of the central practices in Du Bois's own time was that of lynching. Lynching was a ritual where, and now I'm going to appropriate Tal's language for ends he did not intend, but lynching was a ritual where conceptions of who we are is collectively, right, formed. I use this example not because this is Tal's view, it isn't, but because if we want to recover a vision of democracy as a way of life, then we must provide a more robust account of its normative habits, even if derived from religion. And we need to do so in a way that clearly positions us to distinguish between competing and more troubling ways of organizing human life, among which includes white supremacy as a form of life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melvin, for that powerful response. And so now we will begin the conversation part of the event. And first, I would just like to invite Tal to respond to the responses, if he would like to say a few words.
So first, let me just say thank you to both of you. I think the short version of my answer is yes. That is, I find much to agree with in both of the comments, both in where we need to go next, as well as reflecting some of the key points that I wanted to make. And let me just highlight a couple of points so I know I won't do everything. I think one of the things that really comes out in Irina's comments are that sense that we are not formed necessarily in a way that all of our habits fit together. That is, the formation we may get in one site may be at odds with others. And I actually think that's a really crucial part of our present moment. And I think it also points to the way in which one of the ways that habits become conscious is when they come into conflict with each other, right? So where I'm confronted with a situation where certain of my sort of intuitive response inclines me one way and one in another way. And that's precisely what prompts me to think through what are these kinds of habits. And that, I think, is one of the crucial things that we do. And I think it also pertains to the point, I don't want to say that, well, it's bad for these things to become conscious. But I do think that we need to appreciate how much work the unconscious, the merely habitual, in quotation marks, does, as well as to recognize the ways in which we can't exclusively rely on what has been made explicit. A lot more to say on that, but I think I want to, turning to Melvin's point, the point from Du Bois seems absolutely crucial to the kind of point I want to make, right? And part of that is that not all habits are good, but that habits matter. And I take the point from Du Bois to be precisely to be pointing to, well, the point that is raised in relationship to Du Bois and thinking about the role of lynching and the kind of sense of community and identity that it forms is showing even more clearly the horrific work that is being done by those practices, as well as what's at stake in those practices, whether they are as explicit as that, or, you know, I think of the kind of debates over what goes into elementary school textbooks about the Civil War, or the sites of education that I think that a lot of habits are being formed, and it's why that formation matters so much. I guess is what I want to say. I agree that the structure of habit is a formal and can sort of support certain kinds of commitments that we might think are defensible and others that we do not. I think it's a longer story in terms of how we develop what the norms are for adjudicating between what we think are more defensible and more deeply problematic habits. So I can say more on that, but I feel like I've already perhaps gone on longer. So I'd be glad to hear more from others.
Okay, Great. Why don't we turn to one of the audience questions and see where that takes us. This is from Michael Steinberg. Thank you, Tal. How does the quote spiritual end quote foundation of habit handle plurality and diversity? Can an attachment to democracy, a democratic era ethos, be built on habits and attachments to process, such as voting and debate and compromise?
It's a great set of questions. I think it also, it highlights one reason I focus perhaps more on the formal here is I think there are real limits to how far Hegel in particular takes us in thinking about the habits necessary for democracy. You know, I think Hegel gives us a lot of resources for thinking well about democracy, but there are a lot of limits to his own. I mean, he's not a democrat in the way that I understand that term. I would highlight the sense that but I do think that the account of spirit and the formation of habits can certainly be habits of how we attend to each other. And I think this goes back to some of the questions that Irina raised as well. I think it's it's very much an issue of habituation of how we listen to other people, how we respond, who we listen to, who we think is worth listening to. And I think even when we think about, mundanely the difference in what a seminar looks like in an interdisciplinary humanities setting versus in other academic disciplines, the economics department at the University of Chicago, and the different habits of listening and who speaks first, I think those get deeply ingrained in university seminars as well as on playgrounds and a variety of instances. And I think the account can think about the ones around debate, compromise, and listening. So,
Irina or Melvin, let's start with Irina. Did you want to speak to that question?
Yeah, I think I would just say that I agree. I just wanted to maybe emphasize again the point I was trying to make. It's sort of what you just said. How do the university seminar room and the playground, how do they go together? How is it that these different backgrounds that maybe encourage different unconscious habits either clash and thus possibly pull us in different directions, or sort of go together? How sort of do the multiple backgrounds talk to each other? And what can we do to encourage the kind of transformation we might want to see, or to strengthen the bulwarks that we want to protect?
Melvin, did you want to address that question?
Yeah. So on the last question, I mean, the answer is yes. An attachment to democracy can be built on habits of attachment to processes. I mean, we find ourselves confronting this right now, right? The attack on the election is an attempt to erode the sort of habit of participating in it and trusting the process, right? So the answer to that is yes. I mean, on the question of how does the spiritual foundation of habit sort of handle plurality and diversity, I mean, I think this is an important question, that Tal's piece has to grapple with. It seems to me we need to be able to distinguish between, William Barber of the Poor People's Campaign and Jerry Falwell, right? I want to say one of these is to be preferred, William Barber, and Jerry Falwell is not to be preferred, right? But to make that distinction as expressive of what democracy means, but we now need to specify what it means, right? So we need to say something more about the norms to which we want to habituate people to, right?
I just want to jump in here and say, not only do I think that is absolutely crucial, but I think, there's a question to be kind of confronted about whether and how approaches to habit and belief and assumptions of the background differ let's just say in this country along the lines of what is now a fundamental political divide in the country. So for example, I mean, I'm thinking in particular of George Lakoff's work on, the different ways in which the two parties in this country seek to reach their publics and the different kinds of frameworks that they use. And one of his points is that the Republican Party, and this is kind of pre, the kind of really intense norm shattering that we're seeing now, but relied fundamentally on appeals to authority and on a concept of the father. Whereas, it's always been my kind of perception that one of the great challenges of the Democratic Party is that it is deeply invested in the rendering explicit of norms and habits and a real dedication to self-reflexivity. So I've been sort of thinking just throughout this whole really interesting session, what you might say, Tal, to the question of the political divide in this country and whether there is some way to think diagnostically about the ways in which not only the normative content is different, but actually perhaps the practices and assumptions in relation to habit formation are different.
Yeah, so it's a great set of questions. And I think on the one hand, part of my response is to say that those key differences that you're drawing between what feels like the red America and blue America, or red US and blue US, as it sometimes plays out, seem so basic and I think so fundamental. And I think part of what I want to highlight is precisely the importance of those unconscious habits in undergirding some of those key differences. And again, that's why drawing attention here matters. At the same time, this is one of the places where I do think that Irina's point is really crucial, that we do sometimes overstate how monolithically any of us are formed. That is, even when we take the kind of caricatured figure from one of these movements, or at least when we move beyond the caricature, I think what we often find are more complex people who are inheritors of multiple sets of habits, some of which they may get from a particular family background, some of which we may get from the schooling they had, a particular religious tradition. And part of why I think that matters is not just a kind of aspiration toward accuracy, but that precisely those complexities, those differences and tensions within ourselves and others can be some of the great ways to break open some of that break open some of the fundamental divide, right? So that part of how I may be able to engage with someone who feels like who initially seems to be on the other side of a fundamental divide is precisely by saying, actually, there are some habits that we, some intuitions that we may share. And I take the implications of that intuition to be that access to voting is a good thing, or and that we identify in those perhaps fragmented parts of ourselves, overlap between ourselves and others with whom we seem to disagree. And I think that is part of where Irina's point becomes really crucial. I do think that we also, the question about, well, what is the content of the norms? And I think the part of where I think one needs to develop the relationship between the form of habit and et cetera, on the one hand, with the kind of specific norms of democracy, is precisely what can be made explicit and what can be brought into the open without collapsing. In that I think some of the kinds of political views that I find most objectionable, part of the way I try to mount that argument are precisely the kinds of internal contradictions that come to light when one tries to make explicit what those habits are. right? So saying habits matter doesn't mean that we should never bring those to that we should never, particularly when we come into conflict, that we shouldn't be trying to make those habits explicit, talk about them, and identify the contradictions. And I think that's also one of the ways in which we move through the degrees of fragmentation that we have.
Great, thanks. I'm going to take another audience question here. This is from Richard Crocker. How does the commitment to the separation of church and state contribute to the strength or demise of either or both?
So that's a great set of questions. I think I do have a piece on this that I would be glad to refer you to. One of the things that I think is important to recognize is that Hegel is making the point that the religious institutions and practices, just like some of the other practices that Irina was drawing our attention to earlier, really shape these deep commitments about who we are and how we ought to relate to other people that have profound political consequences, right? It has consequences for thinking about who ought to vote, who is an American, etc. That religious institutions do a lot to shape that. And Hegel, that's part of what I take Hegel to be drawing our attention to in that quote. I don't think theocracy follows from that. That is, I think we often imagine that to avoid a theocracy, we have to say religion has no bearing on politics. And I think that's I simply don't think that follows from the idea that particular religious institutions may shape us in certain ways. I think it does mean that we as citizens or as members of the society, and all of us, do have an interest in the kind of formation that is being provided in particular religious communities, and that there can be a fair bit at stake in that for the polity as a whole.
Great. Thanks, Tal. I'm going to take another audience question here. This is from Andre Willis. And I think it really touches on, not only, it's directly to you, Tal, but I think it really touches on Irina's response as well. Thanks for a terrific paper, Tal, and for great responses from Irina and Melvin. Tal, could you say more about the relation between memory and habit for Hegel? I'm wondering about this because of your emphasis on habit as a kind of refining of a natural self, which lies outside of memory and history. For Hume, for example, memory is vital for habit. What does Hegel do with memory in relation to habit?
It's a great question, and I would look forward to talking with you further about it, Andre. I think there are a few different ways in which I think memory certainly comes to bear. One of the pieces that comes to mind are the kinds of remembered stories and narratives that we have about defining moments of our history that define us as an us. And I think memory plays a really important role in that. At the same time, I don't think that, and I mean that more in the sense of memory in relationship to memorials and identities more than our record of perhaps precisely what happened, the actual events. That would be one of the pieces I would think about. I think that we do have habits of remembering as well. And one of the ways in which we certainly instill but also reinforce certain habits is through remembering certain kinds of events. So I think those would be a couple of the places I would start, but I would be interested to talk with you more about it and thinking about it in relationship to Hume.
Irina, do you have any thoughts about this question?
Yeah, I would maybe raise two more things about the question of memory, about the idea of maybe what role also fiction plays in cultivating habit in a certain way, because memorials and sort of the repetition of ritual that we engage in when we try and care for history in a certain way is also always a certain way of telling ourselves a fictitious history of our communities and collectivities. And so I was just wondering sort of too, how those go together. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really important. I guess, one thing I'm thinking about too, and I don't know if this is behind Andre's question, but I felt like I heard this really powerfully in your response, Irina, is whether this notion of kind of background or the achievement of some sort of background is really what's desired, or whether it's maybe conceived a little too absolutely, because I was quite struck by Irina's sort of notion of a ongoing kind of, I'll just say dialectic, between sort of habit formation um, and constant sort of, I'll just say ongoing self-examination. And that the two don't necessarily, and I'm not sure that that I'm understanding you correctly, Tal, and I don't want to misrepresent what you're saying, but I'm not sure that the two need to be so sharply, opposed to one another. I think that, I'm just going to take an example from our institutional life, the DIAP process, okay, that has been going on at Brown since 2016. The Diversity and Inclusion Action Plan, which takes place within departments and it takes place within centers and institutes. And it sort of calls for an ongoing examination of practices, curricular practices, departmental practices, hiring practices, intellectual practices. And I think there's ways in which that kind of ongoing self-examination begins to promote new habits. But I don't necessarily think, and this goes back to the whole question of, that Melvin was talking about, which is just the notion of democracy as itself a kind of habit. But I don't think that that the achievement of a kind of complete background or taken for grantedness is ever really fully achieved. I mean, I could see it as, that's just a sort of further question I have, because I take this emphasis on kind of memory and history to be part of like the ongoing awareness of, what requires a certain kind of self-examination and alertness.
So I think the DIAP and the DIAP 2.0 are probably a really good example of this, or of the way that I think about this, right? In that, of course, there will be a need for ongoing self-examination, ongoing critical interrogation, not just of oneself, but of our practices, et cetera. But part of what I think we hope in the context of a move from a DIAP, the original DIAP to DIAP 2.0, is that certain of the questions and worries, we might have some sense of having examples that are answers that we largely agree on. And we don't have to be, quote, fighting that battle now. We can take for granted certain kinds of commitments to what a commitment to diversity and inclusion in our hiring practices mean. So that something that might have been contentious earlier, let's say holistic review in graduate admissions, might come to be taken for granted as something we should obviously do. Now, that doesn't mean that we won't continue to reflect on exactly what that means, on what the next steps are. I don't think it necessarily involves complacency. And I think particularly if you have norms that do cultivate a kind of critical questioning, you have that. But the idea that we would have certain shared commitments that we might take for granted, that diversity and intellectual excellence go together and are not to be seen as fundamental trade-offs or something like that, to me strikes me as potentially valuable. Now, even our most settled habits will sometimes get called into question, right? And I think arguably that's some of what we feel. By some readings, that's some of what we've seen around January 6th. There's some other readings that I would also think about. But the idea that some of our commitments would become habitual, taken for granted, can be precisely what enables us to go on and critically reflect further on next steps.
Great. So we're kind of coming to close to the end of our time. I first just want to say that Irina's bringing up the question of fiction dovetails with a question that Bonnie Honig put in the chat what role might reading play in the breaking open of familial habits? Are there ways of or approaches to reading as such that support the panelists' different views of habits and democratic norms? I just want to kind of call that very excellent question out. But also at this point, I'd like to invite each of the panelists to just offer any final comments they have if they're in answer to that question. Invite that as well. But how about if I start with Melvin and then Irina and then Tal, you can just say a few final words.
Yeah, well, so I don't know that I have any summary comments. I suppose Tal's last response, right, to sort of speak about habits as forming part of the background is not yet to say that somehow we suspend the processes of inquiry and the confrontation with experience that forces us to reconsider our habits in the first place. But one of the things that I think Tal's reflections center for me is that there's a way in which we often do not attend to the habits that rest in the background of our institutions and our modes of relating to each other. And that the reason why we don't do that is because many of those habits are quite central to how we understand our identity. This is why I ended my comments with white supremacy. And letting go of some habits and sort of crafting new ones in that space, right? That's a space of uncertainty, and that is a space of fear. And one habit that we haven't, or we have a difficult time cultivating, is the habit of letting things die. Right? And because I don't think that we have sort of nurtured that habit as a feature of democratic life, we seem constantly unable to let go of old habits, and in turn, we seem unable to sort of grow and expand as democratic life necessitates.
Thank you very much, Melvin. Irina?
Yeah, I might just very quickly want to say in response to about maybe needing to let certain things die as also a habit we can cultivate, to maybe democracy not just as a way of life, but as a way of becoming, and an endless becoming in certain ways of then sort of a habit, making a habit out of being open to transformation and letting in the new as well.
Thank you. And Tal, you have the last word.
Great. Well, thank you very much to everyone for each of these comments. I just briefly on Bonnie's comment about reading as such, I guess I'm curious what reading as such is. That is, I'm interested in the different practices of reading that we have and the ways in which different reading practices themselves cultivate different senses of the self, different relationships to existing institutions and so forth. So I'd love to get to talk about that more. I think the final points, I like very much that indication of the open-endedness of democratic habits, and that the habit of questioning is certainly one of the habits that we very much want to cultivate. But I think part of what Melvin's most recent comment also brings home to me is this point that I think often some of the political actors with whom I am not in sympathy, that is certain more, say, extremely conservative groups in the US, have actually been much more attentive to the power of habit and have been very effective for that reason. And so I think part of my call is precisely for those who might oppose those political agendas to be much more attentive to things like the role of school boards and other kinds of sites where those habits are formed as being really crucial to the life of our democracy. Thank you very much, Amanda, and to everyone today.
Yes, and I just want to add my thanks to all the participants, to the audience, to the wonderful questions that came in through the Q&A, and just for a really, really terrific conversation and debate. Thank you all. Have a wonderful afternoon.